Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to sit here and introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, Ms. Mami Mizutori. Her lecture this afternoon is a joint effort between the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences and CNRS. A special thanks to CNRS and the Secretary General for allowing us to have this pleasure. Let me reflect on in few minutes on the relevance of this topic and this afternoon session to AUB and in particular to FAFS. And I'll mention that over the last several months, AUB has explored looking into SDG in a very, very serious way. Our faculty had the privilege to really lead a coordinated effort across campus, so we did the mapping, and not to my surprise, that AUB is really leading national and regional effort across the board with the SDGs, except for one, which is sad. We are a coastal campus, we're a coastal city, we're a coastal, lot of impact to and from the coast, and the life undersea is an area that I'm glad I had the chance to talk about this, because this is something that I believe need to be fixed. Across the board, the 17 goals are heavily represented in all of our goals, all of our activities, and not only research, but engagement activities, education activities, except for the life undersea, which is very important to us, the impact of fisheries, the impact on economic, but also on pollution issues. I'm really glad also to announce, and this is probably the first time publicly we'll announce, that AUB has joined now a member of the Sustainable Development Solution Network, SDSN, and we are hosting in Colombia in July, this coming July, a SDG session where we have about 40 participants from across the globe, where we're discussing how can the science community lead the science to policy dialogue. This is the first time, and actually this is probably, it hasn't been publicly announced yet, but I really take this chance to talk about this. As far as our faculty, we have extensive, I call this the faculty of SDGs. We do address 14 of the 17 goals, and primarily looking at water and food security impact on economic development, and a lot of our activities impact the weakest of our communities, women and children. A lot of nutrition activities, a lot of food security, water security that our faculty working on. We're also working very closely with the Global Compact. One of our faculty members at AUB is chairing the Global Compact Network Lebanon, and we're working very closely with them to reach out to the private sector. Finally, go back to the topic of the day. It's really a pleasure to have Dr. Mami Mizutori with us. She's appointed March 1st, 2018 as the Assistant Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Activities. She had a wealth of experiences for the last 25 years in academic, in private, as well as many diplomatic activities. Prior to joining the UN, she was the executive director for the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Culture at the University of East Anglia. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you for taking the time, and really looking forward to learning about the activities and how can we be of service. Thank you so much.
I don't have any to go forward? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you very much, Professor Mohat, for your very kind introduction. Professor Hamza, professors and ladies and gentlemen, and I understand that a couple of other students will be joining us, listening to us live stream, so hello to everybody. It is truly a pleasure to be invited to this world-renowned university, the first to be established in the region, to talk about what our office, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is doing. And the reason why I feel that this is such an appropriate venue to do this is because, as you have mentioned right now, Professor, the agriculture and food sciences is so connected to sustainable development. And the theme of disaster risk reduction is ultimately what we need to do in order to achieve sustainable development. And I hope that I can try to explain as much as possible what I mean by that. Now, I'm sure that you all know what disaster is, because wherever you are faced with a lot of disasters every year. In Lebanon here, you have floods, wildfires, storms, snowstorms, and occasionally earthquakes and tsunamis. So we all know that these can challenge us in a very, very difficult way. But then what is a disaster risk, right? So risk is a combination of three things. As you see in this chart, you first have the hazards. So hazards can be the natural hazards like earthquake, tsunami, or storm. You have also man-made hazards like pandemics, epidemics. And the first chart you're seeing is a chart that shows the severity of hazard depending on where you are. And you can see that Asia Pacific, the area where I come from, is quite disaster prone, and you can see that Australia is pretty red too. But hazard alone does not define the risk that we face. It is combined with exposure. And exposure is the number 2 chart. So exposure is the amount of assets, things that are exposed to hazards. And the more that you have growth, the more you are developed, naturally you have more exposure. So you can see again here that when you look at North America, there's quite a lot of red spots, and that is because actually it is a very developed area. But then the third element of risk is vulnerability, and it is about the weak spots in the society, in the country. And when you look at that, Africa is very vulnerable, you can see. So risk is a combination of these three things, and it is not only about how strong a natural hazard or a man-made hazard is. It becomes stronger and stronger when you are exposed more and you are more vulnerable. And if you don't understand what is your disaster risk where you are in your society, in your country, it is very difficult to prevent yourself from that. And the work we do at our office is to support member states and all actors in countries to reduce the risk before a disaster comes. It's about prevention. It's not about only relief and recovery. It's a lot to do about what do you do before disaster strikes. And we have made some progress in terms of disaster risk reduction. So if you look at the chart on the left hand above, we see that by and large, the victims, people perishing in disasters, is decreasing. And this is thanks to the improvement of early warning systems and whatnot. So that is something that we can be very proud of, but we will later see that it's not only the thing that we need to work on. And the hazards that are the most deadly are the weather-driven events, such as, in this case, cyclones. We all know what happened in Africa, South Africa last month. The cyclone Idai hit 3 countries in Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and it will take a long, long time to recover. And I think over 1,000 people have perished in this one cyclone. So these weather-driven events are the ones that represent the major cause of death. And then, importantly, if you look at the chart at the right-hand side, there is a strong correlation between mortality and country income group. So we go back to the vulnerability question. The more vulnerable the country is in terms of where it figures in the income class, and the people in those low-income countries who are even more vulnerable, such as the children, the elderly, the disabled people, these are the people who are hit most by disasters and perish. We also want to look at the economic loss too, because this is something very important. Although you do not die because of a disaster, even if you survive, if you are left with nothing, how do you rebuild your life? For example, again, Cyclone Idai, the port city of Beirut, 90% of their whole infrastructure has been destroyed. Most people living there have been left with nothing. So yes, you have your life, but how are you going to rebuild your life? It's very difficult. It is almost impossible. And when you look at this, you may think that the annual average loss appears negligible in the Arab states. It is true that the impact on the coping capacity of the population is much higher, and this is due to the vulnerability that we talked about. So even if you think that the loss in absolute figures is not that high, you have to always come back to the question of vulnerability. The multi-hazard annual average loss relative to capital stock. So let's look at the past 30 years in the Arab region. It has been affected by more than 270 disasters, and it has resulted in more than 150,000 deaths and affecting approximately 10 million people. When you say affect, there are many ways. You yourself are injured, you lost your livelihood, you lost your house. There are many ways that people can be affected, but 10 million people have been affected in this region in the past 30 years. And while the majority of the fatalities are due to geophysical events such as earthquakes and tsunami, 91% of all storms were caused by floods, storms, droughts, heat waves. Now, what is the characteristic? These are disasters related to climate change. In the past 20 years, globally, too, 90% of the major disasters are climate related. And unfortunately, the intensity and the frequency is getting stronger and stronger. I know that young people are much more conscious about this than people of, let's say, my generation. And it is really something that you properly should be worried about. And it is at least a positive sign to see young people speaking up and not leaving it to other decision makers. So when we think about how can we reduce disaster risk that I mentioned at the outset, we have to identify what are actually the risk drivers and what happens with them. So as I mentioned, climate change is becoming a stronger and stronger risk driver. Weak governance. Now, at the national level, local level, even at the community level, if you do not have a governance structure to cope with disaster risk, then you are facing a lot of challenges. So weak governance is the second driver that we put here. Urbanization. Currently, more than 50% of the whole world lives in urban areas. And this is not an urbanization neat and clean like where we are right now. A lot of the urbanization is done in an informal way. There are a lot of settlements where people are living in the urban area but in extremely bad conditions. And in Africa and even in the Arab states, this urbanization is becoming very, very, very quickly strong. Concentration of economic assets. This means that even if you are growing, the growth itself becomes a risk driver, because if you are growing more, if you are accumulating more economic assets, then there is more to lose when disaster strikes. Poverty and inequality, which is connected to the vulnerability. And finally, the fragile state context, which is something that is very, very close to this region. What does this mean? When disaster strikes in a country or region where there has been protracted conflicts, an area which is just coming out of conflict, or let's say Lebanon, where you are having a large influx of refugees who are coming in not only in the rural areas but also into the urban area, and again settling in an informal way, that is a risk driver. So I think you can associate to a lot of these risk drivers. We need to understand what they are. So what is the world doing in order to reduce the risk from disasters? How many of you have ever heard of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030? Can you raise your hand? Okay, well, I'm not surprised, because we are like the poor cousin of the SDG goals, or the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda for Urbanization, and the Agenda for Humanity. Now, one thing that is all in common is that all these agreements, including the Sendai Framework, they were all adopted by the UN member states between 2015 and 2016. And they all come together. Sendai Framework was actually the first of all these agreements, which was adopted in March 2015. And it is the agreement of all member states to let's not wait until disaster strikes. Let's reduce existing disaster risks and prevent creating new ones. This is the gist of this agreement. And what is also important is the coherent implementation. What does it mean? It means that if you cannot achieve disaster risk reduction, let's say, think about, again, Cyclone Idai, Mozambique. So much money has been put into that country's development, internally, externally, and this has all been wiped out in a matter of a few hours by the cyclone. So if you cannot achieve disaster risk reduction, you cannot have sustainable development. The first, do you know what is the first SDG? Does anyone know? SDG 1 is? No poverty. Exactly. Eradication of poverty. But you may know that every year, 24 million people are driven into poverty because of disasters. So it is so closely connected. And as I said, when you look at the Paris Agreement, 90% of all major events of the past 20 years are climate change induced. So if we cannot move forward all these things together, we're not achieving any of them. And ultimately, we need to achieve what, as the Dean has mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is very important that we keep this all in mind. And if you take one thing away from this lecture, maybe you might remember that there's a framework called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sendai is a city in Japan which was hit by the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. That was in 2011, and in 2015, the Japanese government hosted this conference. So what does the Sendai Framework tell us? First of all, the scope of the framework is very extensive. It talks about natural hazards, small, large scale, frequent, infrequent, sudden, slow onset. What is a slow onset disaster? Drought. Drought is the #1 disaster in Africa, but it's a slow one that comes creepingly. But we're not only talking about natural hazards. Sendai covers also man-made hazards, which are environmental hazards, pollution. I saw that the air in Beirut doesn't look that great. Every year, 7 million people die of pollution. It's a big hazard. Technological hazard, which is what we saw in Fukushima, the nuclear reactor accidents. And then the biological hazards, pandemics and epidemics, which is a big issue now because the world is so connected. Measles, which was once eradicated in a lot of countries, it's still happening in some small areas, but because people move around so much, it comes back to countries where they stopped vaccinating people. So pandemics and epidemics, biological hazards are also covered. The Sendai Framework, for all these hazards, it has set 4 priorities. And they may sound quite obvious, but they are very important. The first priority is that we must understand disaster risk. What do we face? If we don't understand what we are facing, then we can't prevent them. Number 2, strengthen governance. I mentioned that weak governance is a disaster risk driver. Strong governance, rules, regulations, building codes, and structures. In this country, in the Prime Minister's office, you have a disaster risk management unit, which is headed by a gentleman who is with us today. And this unit oversees the coordination. If you don't have this kind of structure in place, then there is not enough governance. And the governance needs money, budget. If you don't give money to a ministry or an agency, they can't do anything. The third priority is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. What does it mean? It means physically, first, when you build anything, you have to make it risk-informed, resilient. This is not only your house, but roads, critical infrastructure like schools, hospitals, but it's also about resilience of your society. Invest in your resilience of society. Know where your vulnerable people are. Know where your elderly people are. That is also important, and that is investing in resilience. And finally, the fourth priority is enhance preparedness in Build Back Better. Build Back Better is very important because, unfortunately, we human beings tend to repeat things. You know, we live in a very nice waterfront. Then a tsunami comes. We should not rebuild there, but many people want to go back to their work. And sometimes there are cultural reasons. Aborigines don't want to leave their land because their ancestors are buried there. But in spite of all these things, we have to build back better unless we create the same thing over and over again. Now, all these agreements adopted in 2015, 2016 have targets that need to be achieved by 2030. And Sendai Framework also have 7 targets that have to be met. This means that if all these targets are met by all the member states, then we have succeeded in our journey. And the first 4 are about decreasing things, decreasing the mortality. I said that it's going down, but still it's quite high. Decreasing affected people, decreasing economic loss, decreasing disruption to critical infrastructure and basic service, such as schools and hospitals. Those are the 4 targets that we need to decrease. There are 3 targets that we need to increase. One is we need more governments with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. Lebanon has a national strategy, and many of your local governments do have, but not all of them yet. And this has to be done first by 2020. We also need to increase international cooperation to disaster risk reduction because a lot of the developing countries, although they receive international cooperation, they won't put it into prevention because they have more pressing needs. They need to build schools, they need to eradicate poverty, they need to build roads. So putting money in prevention is pretty difficult. You need to be politically very bold to do it. But in order to support the developing countries do this, the international community as a whole we have to put more money specifically in disaster risk reduction. So that's about increasing it. And finally, increasing early warning system information and disaster risk information. One thing that I want to mention about the multi-hazard early warning system is that it's not enough to put the system in place. You have to put the system in place, but you need to educate the people so that they listen to the system. A lot of people, even if they're warned, actually, you might be surprised, but they don't listen, they don't evacuate because they don't believe in it or they don't want to. So you need to put in a physical system, and then you need to educate the people to evacuate. And then you also need to construct evacuation pathways, because sometimes even if you want to evacuate, it might not be possible. And one important thing of Sendai Framework is that it's an all-of-society approach. What does it mean? It means that primarily the governments, the member state national governments, have the responsibility to implement this. But that's not enough. You need the local governments, you need the private sector, you need the volunteers, you need the mass media, you need everyone to be on the same boat. In Japan, where I come from, it's so disaster prone that we talk about 3 levels of disaster risk reduction. One is public support that comes from the government. The second is community support. The community has to be together and understand who lives there and help each other. And then finally, it's helping yourself. Like simple things like, always having a stock of 3 days worth of water. This is something that we do in Japan because we know that in the next 30 years, which means it could be tomorrow, a mega earthquake is going to come again, and it is a prediction that up to 320,000 people will die. It's a horrific thing, but we need to try to mitigate the risk as much as possible. And that's why we have 3 levels of support, and that's what all of society approach means. We all have to be aware and do what we need to do. We can't rely only on the government. So this is the National Disaster Loss Database of here. And then you can see that the number of deaths has been 162. The damage in crop hazard, house damaged. And I'm showing this to you. The figures themselves are important, but what is important is that every country has to understand what has happened historically in your country because of disasters. What kind of hazard hit you, and as a result, where did the people perish, where were the crops damaged, and where were the houses damaged. Because again, when you understand what has happened, you can make better preventive policies. So we at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we support countries that all of them have their disaster loss database. And again, this is about Lebanon in 1980 to 2018. And again, the figures in itself are important, but the most important thing is that every government has its disaster loss database, and that you keep on updating it so that you are up to speed of what's happening. Unfortunately, because of climate change, the landscape is changing very quickly. What happened 10 years ago is not maybe what happens 10 years from now. So you have to really keep on updating yourself. And in order to help Lebanon and all member states, at our office, at our organization, we coordinate all the actions, and we advocate. What I'm doing right now is I'm advocating to all of you here and the people who are listening to me in other places. We inform. Inform means we provide science-based evidence about disaster risk reduction. Because why would a government put in budget? Why would the taxpayers want your money to be put into prevention if it's not a science-based evidence? It's not like Peter the Wolf, right? We can't say, okay, a disaster is coming, so you need to put money into it. No, it has to be science evidence. And for that, in your country, you have a very good system, because the National Council for Scientific Research, which is today represented here by Professor Hamze and Dr. Shadi Abdallah, the council is working very, very closely with the government, providing the government with science evidence so that the government is confident of the policy that they are putting in place for disaster reduction. We also campaign and we monitor. We monitor what does it mean. So if you go back, if you remember the 7 targets, how do we understand that the 7 targets are being achieved? We measure it by asking the member states to submit data related to all those 7 targets. So we are the depository of the data, and through that we monitor, and hopefully by 2030 we have achieved the Sendai Framework goals. We have regional conferences in all 5 regions every 2 years. And last year in October, we had the Africa-Arab Platform. Platform is the word we use for a conference, the regional platform for disaster risk reduction in Tunisia. And we had 32 ministers of African and Arab states coming. And we did several things, but the most important things we did is we saw how much Sendai Framework was being implemented. It's only 3 years, so not too much. But we encouraged all the member states, and member states encouraged each other. And we called for enhanced all of society engagement by inviting not only governments, but all the stakeholders. And if you look at the last part, this is very important. So we have different groups. We have the group for the Science and Technology Advisory Group, the Children and Youth Group, the Civil Society Group, Gender Equality and Women Empowerment Group, and we have the Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies, which means that all the different stakeholders came to Tunisia in October last year, and over 900 participants, and we all shared our lessons learned and the best practices so that by 2030, the Sendai Framework will be accomplished. Now, one of the last points I want to make is the role of higher academic institutions and research. And this is about this university, this is about this faculty, and this is about all of you here. Because there's a lot of progress that we can make in disaster risk reduction by working more closely with academia and institutions. Because there are so many innovations that we are seeing that can be put into the disaster risk reduction measures, like the drones, the way that the geospatial, the satellites. The satellites now give us very accurate images of the before and after of a disaster, allowing us to understand what happens with disaster, and using those images, we can also understand where are the vulnerabilities. So that's only one example, but innovative methodologies is very important. Data. If you don't have data, you can't understand what's happening. So data, big data, open source data is very important to measure whether we are successful in achieving the Sendai Framework. And we also need to think beyond the box. Now, I'm UN staff. I try a lot to try to think outside the box, but I think scientists, young scientists, are much better in thinking outside the box. So we need you to think outside the box, and we need you to engage in what we're doing. We need to work with you more collaboratively, and we ask you to join us in this journey of disaster risk reduction. And as a very concrete point, we are always looking for young people who want to join our work. We have our headquarters in Geneva. We are a very small organization, about 120 people, but we are all very committed. We have 5 regional offices. The office for the Arab states is in Cairo. We have an office in Nairobi for the African states. We have an office in Thailand, Bangkok for the Asia Pacific, Brussels for Europe, and Panama for Latin America. Now, anyone can work in any region, but the goal is to together reduce disaster risk. So if you are interested in what we're doing, we have a lot of posts for young people as well. You don't have to come and work with us in order to join this, but that's one thing that I wanted to leave with you. And that's all, and thank you very much for your attention. And I don't know how much time more we have. I think we have like 15 more minutes, so if you have any questions, I'm very happy to take. Yes.
Thank you very much for the very nice, informative lecture. I have two questions. Number one, where can we get your data? Is it available? This data, like some of the data you showed, it's very interesting. But it's available to the public, the data?
So we have a website which is called the Prevention Web. That one, okay. Yes. So that is our most comprehensive platform, which has a lot of information, not only about what I have talked today, but much more about disaster risk reduction.
Okay, thank you. My next question, do you consider wars as a man-made disaster?
Okay, that's a good question. I do believe it is, but fortunately, it is not in our remit. I say fortunately because it is a bit too much of a thing, but for us to deal with. But as I mentioned, there is more and more focus in this area about the correlation between disaster and conflict. So disaster, sometimes like water scarcity being the cause of conflict, and also when there is conflict and disaster strikes, the impact is much stronger. There are a lot of countries which are starting to look into this very closely. So we look in that in the context of fragile states, but we do not look into war itself.
Yeah, because the numbers we saw about the, sorry, maybe I'm taking much more time than I should, but the numbers we saw about the losses in this region in the past 30 years, it was 150,000. Well, unfortunately, we had many more in Iraq and Syria in the last 5 years.
Yes.
Very unfortunate.
Yes. The lady.
Yes. Thank you. I was a little bit confused,
yes,
because we are a foundation that works on water and sanitation. And when I see all your goals and targets, it goes straight to SDG 6 also, our targets. Mm-hmm. So what is the difference, or more, something more than us as SDG 6 and Sendai Framework? Mm-hmm. I was really confused. Right. And we know that climate change is mainly also on water and all this stuff. Yes. So if I do this SDG 6, I do Sendai disaster framework?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so water-related, as you mentioned, natural hazards is one of the biggest causes of mortality and economic loss. So there is a correlation. So if we can reduce the risks that come from water-related natural hazards, we are achieving some of our goals. The other thing is that when we talk about water, it is also about the infrastructure, I believe. And then, so when we talk about resilient infrastructure, it's not only about infrastructure that we see. It's about the water reservoirs, it's about the pipelines. So making these infrastructure resilient is actually very, very important in the context of especially urbanization, many people think that if you make your own house strong enough, you're fine, but you're not fine, because even if your house is fine, if all the water lines and sewage lines and whatnot are cut off, then immediately you're facing a tragedy. So in that sense, the SDG Goal 6 about water and sanity, water sanity is very much connected to what we do.
What goes more with you as a disaster risk management?
When you say more, what do
More than what we do on water. What should we do to make the Sendai Framework if we all more than the water SDG 6? It is the buildings that we do,
Yes.
everything is included in Sendai, not only infrastructure for water.
Yes, yes.
So it's all our life.
Yes, it's everything. It's everything, yes. Water is one important component, but it's everything else, yes.
May I ask about your rich sister?
The
The rich sister.
wrist?
The rich sister.
Rich?
The SDGs.
Yes, yes.
If you achieve, I mean, I see they're both in the moving human resilience and human security in the same direction.
Right.
But because of the SDGs has more, maybe publicity, maybe more resources, maybe more, because I've noticed in your targets, there's no quantitative. You say substantially increase, substantially improve. The SDGs have more binding towards the government. How do you synergize between achieving the SDGs and adding resilience to disaster relief in your effort?
So actually, there is some. It's not as strict as SDGs, but if you take the targets, the target A and B, what it says in the Sendai Framework is that we're going to compare between the baseline of 2005 and 2015 and 2020 and 2030. And we're going to see if the number of that 10 years between 2005 and 2015, and if you compare it with 2020 and 2030, whether the number has gone down substantially by every 100,000 people. So it's not totally precise, but that's the measurement. So we're going to compare it against the baseline. It's the same with affected people too. And there are actually a technical guideline which is quite technical and quite detailed about what do you mean about affected people. So I mentioned things about injured, losing livelihoods, whatnot. If you go into the technical guidelines, there is a much more detailed definition that, again, the member states agreed on what do you mean by affected people. And this one will also be compared against the baseline of 2005, 2015, and 2020, 2030. Now, in terms of the economic loss, again, there is it's going to be compared against the GDP. So it's not absolute economic loss, but again, when comparing between the baseline of the 10 years, as I mentioned, and the 10 years from 2020, 2030, we're going to compare the economic loss as of the ratio of the GDP. So it becomes a bit more accurate. It's not only about taking randomly the absolute loss. Now, in other things like the international cooperation, you are right. There is no let's increase it by 150% or let's make it this much $1 million. We don't have a precise figure there, and it was very difficult. And that's why it's not like the Paris Agreement, where there is a specific, more, how should I say, commitments made by the developed countries in terms of how much they will put into the pot. That is not there, and that is why I feel that, as we were talking today, there is more money that is going into climate change, but it is very difficult to bring money into disaster risk reduction. In terms of the early warning system too, we're not talking about how many, but so it is a bit abstract. I understand that. But there is definitions about what is a multi-hazard early warning system that we need to put in. It's first, it's multi-hazard. Second, it needs to look into the vulnerability, so it needs to look into the impact. It has to be impact-based, which means that you can't only announce early warning hazard system, early warning system. It has to be based on the disaster loss data so that it reaches the most vulnerable people. So there are those kind of detailed definitions if you go into the technical guideline. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My question is related to the earthquake at a regional level.
Yes.
Certainly you agree on the fact that earthquake is the main disaster, natural disaster
Yes.
may occur
Yes.
in this region, especially when I'm talking about the Eastern Mediterranean countries.
Yes.
But to overcome this problem and
Yes.
to treat it and to have a national plan how to face such a challenges, I think it is not anymore only a national initiative, should be coordinated among other countries.
Yes.
For you, you are working and you are supervising the joint efforts in the whole region. Do you think, are you happy with the coordination among the Eastern Mediterranean country, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, to coordinate their effort in case we have to face such a major disaster?
Well, I'm going to say that's a good question because that's a difficult question.
This is not very diplomatic question.
Yes. No, but I understand what you say. First of all, in the science of earthquakes, and I'm a bit hesitant to mention all this in front of Dr. Abdallah, but I believe that the science of, if I may say, the prediction of earthquake is getting better. That's what I've read. That now you can predict within a span of like 30 years. Now you may think that that's a long time, but in the science of earthquake, apparently that's a big improvement. And also now and I'm not talking about the regional cooperation, but globally there are more institutes which are gathering data of specific earthquakes, where they happen, under what kind of geological condition, and they provide that information to other countries which have similar geological aspects. So that information shares to understand more of what could happen to you. Now, I confess that I'm not an expert specifically about how all this is happening in this region, but I suspect that under the current fragility of the region as such, it's a big challenge, to say the least, I would imagine. First, you need to have a rather stable atmosphere in the region, in the countries, and also a willingness to share all the information you have on these things. Because seismic information, it has a lot to do with the topology of your country, and it could be quite sensitive too. So probably, Professor, when you're asking the question, you're feeling that the cooperation is not enough. So there you go. Yes.
Just a follow-up on Dr. Muhtar's question. How binding is the framework for those countries that sign up?
Okay.
The major failure of Kyoto was it was top-down,
Yes.
and there were no binding mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
The Paris Agreement does have, it's a bottom-up basically,
Right.
and it does have stock-taking every certain number of years, and there is a monitoring process and that evaluates progress.
Yes.
Is there anything built into this, or that will be built into this?
So the Sendai Framework is not a legally binding agreement. It does not have any legal obligations to the member states who adopted it, who signed up to it. It was adopted by consensus, but it does not have legal obligations. So if countries do not abide by it, then that is it. if I say a bit sarcastically. But my belief, and I'm saying this not because we are the custodian of the framework, it is that disaster is something that we are all facing now. It doesn't matter whether you are in Sweden last summer, there were wildfires there. It doesn't matter where you are in the Caribbean. Wherever you are, there is so much disasters that's happening. So it's becoming, in a way, everybody's business. And the other thing is that disasters that happen in one part of the world can easily affect you. To give you just two examples, in 2011 in Thailand, where a big industrial manufacturing center was flooded, it compromised so much of the production of hard disks, that I think like 1/3 of the world's whole production of disks were not being manufactured. And also because of the supply chain, which is so long now, and the food chain, talking about food science, is so long, a disaster that happens in one region, and if two disasters happen in two major regions of food production, that will easily affect you. So my hope is that we all become more conscious about this connection, and that we all commit to what we have committed to, not legally, but in this framework. Just give you one more example, and maybe time is up. So one of the biggest boosts of this agenda was the 2004 Aceh tsunami, because if you remember, in Boxing Day in 2004, a tsunami hit the Indian Ocean, and a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, perished, but a large majority of them were tourists who had come from European or American, North American countries where they had never experienced tsunami. They didn't know what was happening. They went to sea, but they went to the beach and were seeing what's coming, and they were flushed away. And that was when people understood that, okay, disaster is everybody's business, because my country may not have tsunami, but if I go on my vacation to Thailand, I may be hit by a tsunami. So I hope that this awareness that really disaster that happens in the far end of the world is not their business, but it can become my business. I hope that although this is not legally binding, that countries that have signed up to it will do their utmost to make this a reality. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.